They took everything. Now, before God, I vow revenge.
Francesca Esposito learned 3 things at her father's funeral: that blood looks black when it soaks into expensive Italian marble, that her 3 brothers could die in under 60 seconds when caught unprepared, and that becoming the head of a Camorra crime family requires absolutely no training when everyone else in line for succession is bleeding out in a Naples cathedral. She learned these lessons in the space of 5 minutes on a Tuesday morning in October, standing in the Basilica di San Paolo Maggiore, wearing Prada, and watching her entire family get massacred during her father's memorial service. By the time the gunfire stopped and the screaming started, Francesca was no longer Don Esposito's educated daughter who'd been kept safely away from family business in Milan. She was the last Esposito standing, which made her something far more dangerous: a woman with nothing left to lose and an empire's worth of revenge to claim. The morning started with rain, which every Neapolitan knows is bad luck for a funeral, but perfect cover for an ambush. Francesca had flown in from Milan the night before, sleeping in her childhood bedroom that her mother kept exactly as she'd left it 6 years ago when she escaped to study business at Bocconi University. The plan was simple: attend her father's funeral with dignity, comfort her mother and brothers, and return to Milan within 48 hours to continue building the luxury fashion consulting business she'd worked so hard to establish. Francesca had spent 6 years creating a life separate from the Camorra, from the violence and blood feuds that defined Naples, from the weight of being Don Esposito's daughter. She'd changed her last name to Romano on all her business documents, cut her dark hair into a sophisticated Milan style, and learned to speak the language of legitimate business instead of the coded threats that passed for conversation in her father's world. But walking into the basilica that morning, surrounded by hundreds of mourners who were really soldiers in expensive suits, Francesca felt the weight of her real name settling back onto her shoulders like a coat she'd tried to discard but never truly escaped. Her father's casket sat at the altar, draped in flowers that cost more than most Neapolitans earned in a year, and Francesca could feel every eye in the church watching her, evaluating, calculating, wondering if Don Esposito's university-educated daughter understood the world she'd been born into even if she'd tried to run from it. Her mother sat in the front pew, elegant in black, her face a mask that revealed nothing. Beside her sat Francesca's 3 brothers: Marco, the eldest at 32, who'd been groomed since birth to inherit their father's empire; Antonio, 30, the enforcer who handled problems that required violence more than strategy; and Luca, 28, the charmer who managed relationships with politicians and police. Francesca took her seat beside her mother, feeling the familiar guilt that came with every family visit. The knowledge that while she'd been building spreadsheets and courting clients in Milan, her brothers had been fighting wars in Naples that she'd chosen not to see. Her mother reached for her hand, and Francesca squeezed back, both of them knowing without words that the Esposito family was about to fracture into whatever came after Don Esposito's death. There would be power struggles, probably violence, definitely betrayal. That's how it always went when a Camorra boss died. The only question was whether the family would survive the transition or be consumed by rivals who'd been waiting for exactly this moment of weakness. The priest was midway through a prayer when the first shots rang out. Francesca's brain registered the sound half a second before understanding what it meant, and in that half second, she watched her brother Marco's head snap back as a bullet entered his temple from a sniper positioned in the basilica's upper gallery. Marco dropped like someone had cut his strings, blood spraying across the white flowers on their father's casket, and then chaos erupted. More gunfire, automatic weapons, multiple shooters, coordinated assault, and Francesca's brothers were reaching for weapons that weren't there because you don't come armed to your father's funeral. Antonio managed to draw a concealed pistol and fired twice at figures moving through the panicked crowd before a burst of gunfire stitched across his chest and he collapsed across the pew. Luca was shouting something, trying to shield their mother, when bullets found him too. 3 rapid impacts that threw him backward and left him gasping on the marble floor. Francesca's mother screamed, a sound of pure anguish that cut through the gunfire and chaos, and then she was moving toward Luca's body, and Francesca was grabbing her, pulling her down behind the pews as bullets continued to tear through the basilica. All around them, people were dying. Family members, associates, rivals who'd come to pay respects, innocents who'd just been attending Mass. The attack wasn't surgical. It was a message written in blood across sacred ground. Someone wanted the Esposito family erased completely, and they'd chosen the most public, most humiliating method possible. Francesca held her mother behind a stone column as the shooting continued, her mind working through shock toward something colder and more useful. This wasn't random violence. This was the Russo family, the rival clan that controlled the eastern neighborhoods of Naples and had been fighting the Espositos for territory since before Francesca was born. Don Russo must have planned this for months, waiting for Don Esposito to die of the cancer that had been eating him from inside, then striking at the funeral when the entire family would be vulnerable and distracted by grief. It was brilliant and brutal, and exactly the kind of move that would cement Russo's dominance over Naples if it succeeded. The only problem with Russo's plan was that he'd forgotten about Francesca, or more likely he'd dismissed her as irrelevant because she was a woman who'd run away to Milan and played at legitimate business. That was going to be Russo's fatal mistake. The shooting stopped after what felt like hours, but was probably less than 3 minutes. Francesca heard shouting in the distance, police sirens probably, though the Camorra owned enough cops that response time was always strategically delayed during family business. She peered around the column and saw the carnage, bodies everywhere, her 3 brothers dead or dying, her father's casket riddled with bullets as a final insult, and standing in the center aisle, surrounded by his own soldiers, was Salvatore Russo, the man who'd ordered this massacre. He was 60, gray-haired, wearing a suit that probably cost as much as a car, and he was smiling as he surveyed his work. Russo's eyes found Francesca, and his smile widened. He walked toward her slowly, confident and relaxed because what threat could one unarmed woman possibly pose? He stopped 10 feet away and spread his hands in a gesture that might have been apologetic if not for the bodies between them. "Francesca Esposito," he said, his Neapolitan accent thick and mocking. "Or do you call yourself Romano now in Milano? I'm sorry for your loss, truly. Your father was a worthy opponent. Your brothers—" He glanced at their bodies and shrugged. "Less so, but business is business, and Naples cannot have 2 families fighting for control. So I have solved the problem. The Esposito family is finished. You are free to return to Milano and your fashion consultants and your civilized life. Forget Naples, forget the Camorra, live." Francesca stood slowly, still holding her mother who was sobbing against her shoulder. She looked at Russo with eyes that showed nothing of what she was feeling. Not grief, not fear, not rage, just cold calculation. When she spoke, her voice was steady and clear enough to carry through the destroyed basilica. "You're right about one thing, Don Russo. The Esposito family as it was is finished. My father's generation is dead. My brothers are dead, but I am very much alive, and I'm not going back to Milano." Russo's smile faltered slightly. "You are one woman with no soldiers, no territory, no power. What exactly do you think you can do?" Francesca's response was quiet but carried absolute certainty. "I'm going to rebuild my family's empire. And then I'm going to destroy you so completely that your name becomes a warning story mothers tell their children about what happens when you underestimate women." Russo laughed, but there was uncertainty in the sound. He gestured to his soldiers. "Go home, little girl. This is no world for you." Then he walked away, leaving Francesca standing in her family's blood with her mother weeping and her brothers' bodies cooling on marble that had witnessed centuries of Naples violence. Francesca didn't move for a long time. She stood there as police finally arrived, as her mother was led away by relatives, as forensic teams began photographing the massacre. And she made a promise to her dead father, her dead brothers, and mostly to herself. She would take back everything Russo had stolen. Not because she wanted power or wealth or the criminal empire her father built, but because Naples was her city, and she wouldn't let a man who murdered families in churches rule it. She would become something her father never imagined and Russo couldn't predict. She would become the first female Don in Camorra history, and she would do it by being smarter, more ruthless, and more willing to change the rules than any man who'd come before her. The funeral that was supposed to bury Don Esposito ended up burying the old Camorra along with him. What rose from those ashes was something new, something dangerous, something that looked like a well-dressed woman from Milan but fought like the daughter of Naples she'd always been underneath. Francesca Esposito was about to go to war, and Don Russo would discover too late that the most dangerous enemy isn't the one you fight, it's the one you dismiss. For her brothers, supporting her devastated mother, and appearing weak enough that Naples' criminal underworld dismissed her as irrelevant. She wore black, cried at appropriate moments, and let Don Russo's soldiers watch her family's properties get quietly absorbed into his territory without protest. To every observer, Francesca Esposito looked like exactly what she was supposed to be. A broken daughter who'd lost everything and would soon disappear back to Milan where she belonged. That was exactly what Francesca wanted them to believe, while she spent every private moment planning her war. The reality was that Francesca had been studying her father's empire since she was 12 years old, long before anyone thought to teach her because daughters weren't considered heirs. While her brothers learned to shoot and fight and intimidate, Francesca learned something more valuable. She learned the business. She knew every property her family owned, every legitimate company that fronted illegal operations, every politician and police officer on the payroll, every alliance and grudge spanning decades. Her father used to joke that Francesca had a mind like a computer, remembering details that even his most trusted advisors forgot. He'd been proud of her intelligence, but never imagined she'd use it for this. Now that computer-like mind was calculating how to rebuild an empire with no soldiers, no money she could access, and every rival family watching to ensure she stayed powerless. Francesca's first move was unexpected. She called a meeting with Tommaso Greco, her father's former consigliere, who'd somehow survived the Basilica massacre by arriving late. Greco was 70, weathered by decades of Camorra wars, and completely loyal to Don Esposito's memory, even if he had no faith in the Don's daughter. They met at a cafe in Spaccanapoli, the ancient heart of Naples, where narrow streets and crumbling buildings hid secrets older than the Camorra itself. Greco arrived with suspicion written across his lined face, clearly expecting Francesca to beg for help she had no right to request. Instead, Francesca laid out a plan that made Greco's eyes widen with something between horror and grudging respect. "Don Russo thinks he's won," Francesca said quietly, stirring espresso she had no intention of drinking. "He killed my brothers because they were predictable, violent men who would have reacted with more violence until Russo ground them down completely. But he left me alive because he thinks I'm irrelevant. That's his mistake. I'm going to destroy his empire using something he doesn't understand and can't fight. Economics and politics instead of bullets and blood." Greco shook his head. "With respect, Signorina Esposito, you have no soldiers to enforce economic warfare. The moment you move against Russo, he'll have you killed." Francesca smiled, and it was the same cold smile her father used to wear when he was 3 moves ahead in a negotiation. "I don't need soldiers yet. I need you to do something for me, Tommaso. I need you to spread a rumor through Naples that I'm broken, that I'm selling everything my father owned for pennies because I need money to escape Italy. Make it believable. Frighten daughter liquidating assets to disappear before Russo decides to finish what he started. Every property, every business, everything for sale at desperate prices." Greco studied her carefully. "And what does this accomplish besides making you look weak?" Francesca's answer was simple. "It makes Russo greedy. He'll buy everything through shell companies, thinking he's stealing my family's empire for nothing. What he won't realize until too late is that he's buying businesses I've already hollowed out, properties with hidden liens, operations that will bleed money instead of making it. By the time he understands, he'll have invested millions into assets that destroy him from inside." It was brilliant and subtle, and exactly the kind of warfare that Naples' criminal world wasn't prepared for. Greco agreed to help, partly out of loyalty to Don Esposito's memory, and partly because he was curious to see if this university-educated daughter could actually pull off what she was promising. Over the next month, properties began selling: restaurants, warehouses, construction companies, everything the Esposito family had built over 40 years. Russo bought it all through intermediaries, probably congratulating himself on eliminating his rival family so completely that even their assets were his. What Russo didn't see was Francesca in Milan, using her business connections to structure the sales in ways that would trigger financial disasters months down the line: tax investigations, labor disputes, environmental violations, regulatory scrutiny that would cost Russo 10 times what he paid to acquire the properties. But Francesca's economic warfare was only phase 1. Phase 2 required something more dangerous: allies. Not the traditional Camorra soldiers who'd follow whoever paid them or scared them most, but people with actual power in Naples who were tired of the violence destroying their city. Francesca began meeting with business owners, politicians, community leaders, even a few honest cops who'd been fighting corruption for years. Her pitch was revolutionary. Help me take down Don Russo, and I'll transform the Esposito family from a criminal organization into something that actually benefits Naples instead of bleeding it. Most people dismissed her as naive. A few were intrigued, and one person believed her completely. Marco Calabresi was a captain in the Carabinieri, Italy's national police force, and he'd been investigating Camorra activities in Naples for 8 years, with frustratingly little success because corruption ran so deep that every case got sabotaged from within. When Francesca approached him with evidence from her father's files, documentation of political bribes, police payoffs, murder contracts spanning decades, Marco saw an opportunity he'd been waiting for his entire career. "If I help you," Marco said carefully during their secret meeting in a church confessional, "what exactly are you offering in return?" Francesca's answer was honest. "I'm offering you a chance to arrest Don Russo for crimes that will put him away forever, but in exchange you leave me alone to rebuild my family in a way that doesn't require your attention." Marco should have arrested Francesca right then. She was openly admitting to planning criminal activities. But Marco had seen 8 years of violence destroy Naples, had buried colleagues killed by mob hits, had watched children grow up in neighborhoods where Camorra rule was absolute. If this woman could actually dismantle Russo's organization and replace it with something less destructive, Marco was willing to bend rules he'd spent his career defending. They made a deal that would have gotten them both imprisoned if anyone discovered it. Francesca would provide evidence against Russo in exchange for immunity and freedom to operate in carefully defined boundaries. It was corruption in service of justice, or justice that required corruption. The line was too blurred to see anymore. The complication Francesca didn't anticipate came from inside her own family. Her mother, Sofia Esposito, had been silent since the massacre, traumatized, grieving, barely speaking to anyone. But when Sofia discovered what Francesca was planning through overheard phone calls and documents left carelessly visible, she exploded with rage that had been building through weeks of numbness. They fought in the kitchen of the family's Villa Posillipo, overlooking the Bay of Naples, where Greek colonists had built civilization thousands of years before the Camorra ever existed. "You will destroy everything your father built," Sofia shouted, tears streaming down her face. "You will dishonor his memory with these schemes and compromises and deals with police." Francesca faced her mother with the same cold determination she'd shown Don Russo. "Papa built an empire on blood and fear. It killed him. It killed my brothers, and it's killing Naples. I won't honor that legacy. I'll replace it with something better." Sofia slapped her daughter hard enough to leave a mark. "You are not Camorra. You are a businesswoman playing at being a boss. The moment you face real violence, real consequences, you will break." Francesca didn't flinch, didn't back down. "Then watch me, Mama. Watch me become something Papa never imagined, and decide if you're going to help me rebuild our family or mourn the one that's already dead." Their relationship fractured that night in ways that might never fully heal. But Francesca couldn't afford sentiment anymore. She'd crossed too many lines, made too many dangerous alliances, declared war on enemies who wouldn't hesitate to kill her the moment they realized she was a threat. 2 months after the Basilica massacre, Francesca's careful planning began producing results. Russo's newly acquired businesses started hemorrhaging money. Regulatory investigations opened into companies he now owned. Politicians Francesca had been quietly meeting with began pushing legislation that would hurt Russo's operations. And most importantly, Russo's own captains started questioning why their Don had spent millions on assets that were destroying them financially. The moment Francesca knew her plan was working came when she received a phone call from an unknown number. The voice on the other end was young, male, and carried the distinctive accent of Naples' Spanish Quarter. "Signorina Esposito? My name is Davide Amato. I've been working for Russo for 6 years, but I'm tired of serving a man who murdered children in a church. If you're serious about rebuilding your family, I want to be your first soldier." Francesca met Davide the next day in a rooftop cafe with views of Vesuvius. He was 28, scarred from knife fights, and carrying the kind of violence in his eyes that came from growing up in neighborhoods where survival required brutality. But when Davide talked about Naples, about the city he loved and hated simultaneously, Francesca heard something else: hope that things could be different. "I'll accept your loyalty on one condition," Francesca told him. "You follow my orders completely, even when they seem weak or strange or nothing like how your previous bosses operated. Can you do that?" Davide studied her for a long moment. This woman who dressed like Milan but spoke like Naples, who looked soft but planned like a general. Then he knelt on the rooftop cafe floor, ignoring the confused stares from tourists drinking wine, and kissed Francesca's hand in the traditional gesture of Camorra loyalty. "I swear on my life I am yours." Francesca accepted the oath, feeling the weight of command settling onto shoulders that had never been trained to carry it. She wasn't Don Esposito's daughter anymore. She was becoming something new entirely, a woman who would rule Naples by being smarter than the men who'd ruled through fear. But as Francesca built her coalition of police allies, political connections, and defecting soldiers, Don Russo finally realized he'd been deceived. The businesses he'd bought weren't assets, they were traps. The silence from Francesca wasn't weakness, it was strategy. And the woman he'd dismissed as irrelevant was actually the most dangerous enemy he'd ever faced. Russo sent a message through traditional channels: meet him alone at the Castel dell'Ovo, the medieval fortress overlooking Naples' harbor, or he'd kill everyone Francesca had contacted, including her mother. Francesca knew it was almost certainly a trap. She also knew that refusing meant Russo would escalate to open warfare that would kill innocents and destroy everything she was building. So she agreed to meet him, walking into what might be her death with nothing but intelligence and courage as weapons. The girl who'd run away to Milan 6 years ago would have been terrified. The woman who emerged from her family's massacre was ready for whatever came next. Francesca arrived at Castel dell'Ovo just after sunset, when the ancient fortress cast long shadows across Naples' harbor, and the Mediterranean turned the color of blood. She came alone, as Russo demanded, though Marco Calabresi and his Carabinieri team were positioned a kilometer away with sniper rifles and surveillance equipment, ready to intervene if Francesca gave the signal. She wore a simple black dress that cost more than most Neapolitans earned in a month, and she carried no weapons, because bringing a gun to meet Don Russo would be both pointless and insulting. If he wanted her dead, his soldiers would kill her regardless of whether she was armed. Francesca walked across the stone bridge connecting the fortress to Naples proper, her heels clicking against ancient rock that had witnessed centuries of violence long before the Camorra existed. Russo waited in the fortress's central courtyard, surrounded by 8 soldiers who watched Francesca with the casual readiness of men accustomed to killing. The Don himself stood at the courtyard's edge, silhouetted against the sunset, looking older than Francesca remembered from the Basilica massacre. "Signorina Esposito," Russo said, turning to face her. "You have caused me considerable inconvenience these past 3 months. The businesses I purchased from you have become financial disasters. Politicians I've owned for years are suddenly investigating my operations. And worst of all, my own soldiers are questioning whether I made a mistake letting you live. His voice carried disappointment rather than anger, like a teacher scolding a promising student who'd chosen rebellion over obedience. Francesca stopped 10 feet away, maintaining careful distance while showing no fear. You made several mistakes, Don Russo. The first was murdering my family in a church. The second was assuming that because I'm a woman who studied business in Milan, I don't understand Naples or the Camorra. And the third was giving me 3 months to build alliances while you celebrated a victory you hadn't actually secured. Russo smiled, and it was the same predatory expression Francesca had seen the day he killed her brothers. And what alliances could you possibly have built? You have 20, maybe 30 soldiers at most, defectors from families I've already absorbed. I have 300. You control no territory. I control everything from Posillipo to Scampia. You have money you smuggled out of your father's accounts. I have the entire Camorra infrastructure. Francesca's response was calm and carried absolute certainty. I don't need soldiers when I have something more valuable, legitimacy. I've spent 3 months meeting with business leaders, politicians, community activists, even the church. I've convinced them that I can transform the Esposito family from a criminal organization into something that benefits Naples instead of destroying it. They're supporting me not because they fear me, but because they believe in what I'm building. Can you say the same? The question landed like a physical blow, and Russo's expression darkened. Legitimacy is a fantasy that weak men and naive women tell themselves. Naples doesn't run on belief. It runs on fear and money and violence. I've built my empire on those foundations, and they're stronger than whatever idealistic nonsense you're selling. Francesca took a step forward, deliberately entering the space where Russo's soldiers could reach her in seconds. Then let's test that theory. I'm offering you a choice, Don Russo. You can continue this war, and I'll use every alliance I've built to destroy you systematically. More investigations, more financial pressure, more of your soldiers defecting to my family. Or you can accept a compromise. We divide Naples. You keep the eastern territories, I rebuild in the west, and we establish rules that limit civilian casualties and reduce the violence that's killing this city. It was a generous offer, far more generous than Russo deserved after murdering her family. But Francesca wasn't interested in revenge that required more bloodshed. She wanted transformation, and that meant finding ways to change the system even if it meant compromising with murderers. Russo studied Francesca with an expression mixing confusion and contempt. You offer me peace? After I killed your father and your brothers? Francesca's voice remained steady despite emotion churning beneath her controlled surface. I offer you a choice between war that destroys us both or peace that lets Naples survive. My father would have chosen war. My brothers would have chosen violence and revenge until everyone was dead. But I'm not my father or my brothers. I'm trying to be something different. The words hung in the Mediterranean air between them, and for a moment Francesca thought Russo might actually consider her offer. But then the Don laughed, a harsh sound without humor. You are weak, just as I suspected. You dress up cowardice as philosophy and call it progress. Russo gestured to his soldiers. I reject your peace, and I reject your continued existence. You will die here, tonight, and whatever ridiculous alliances you've built will crumble when Naples sees that defying me has consequences. The soldiers moved forward, and Francesca stood perfectly still as they surrounded her. She'd prepared for this possibility, had accepted it as likely, but fear still flooded her nervous system because theory and reality are different things when death is seconds away. One soldier grabbed Francesca's arm roughly, forcing her to her knees on the ancient stone. But before Russo could give the final order, a voice cut through the courtyard. I wouldn't do that if I were you, Don Russo. Marco Calabresi stepped through the fortress entrance with 12 carabinieri officers, weapons drawn and aimed at Russo's soldiers. Francesca hadn't given the signal, Marco must have moved when Russo rejected the peace offer, deciding that police intervention was worth revealing his cooperation with Francesca. Russo's face twisted with rage. You brought police to a Camorra meeting? You violated every code, every tradition. Marco interrupted coldly. The only thing being violated tonight is Italian law. We have surveillance footage of you threatening to murder Signorina Esposito. We have warrants for your arrest on charges including murder, racketeering, and conspiracy. And we have testimony from 23 of your former associates who've agreed to testify against you in exchange for reduced sentences. The standoff that followed was tense and electric. Russo's soldiers and Marco's officers both armed, both ready, both waiting for someone to make the first move that would trigger bloodshed. Francesca remained kneeling, her mind racing through scenarios and consequences. If shooting started, people would die, including possibly her. If Russo was arrested now, it would cement her alliance with police and demonstrate that she could protect those who joined her family. But it would also make her seem weak, a woman who needed cops to fight her battles instead of handling Camorra business through traditional methods. The soldiers watching would question whether Francesca could actually lead, whether she understood their world, whether she deserved the loyalty they might have given her. Francesca made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. She stood slowly despite the soldier still gripping her arm, and she spoke to Marco without looking at him. Captain Calabresi, I appreciate your concern, but this is a private business meeting that doesn't require police intervention. Marco's expression showed shock and frustration. Francesca, he just threatened to kill you. Francesca finally met Marco's eyes, and her expression carried a message she couldn't speak aloud. Trust me, let me handle this my way. Don Russo and I were discussing terms. Sometimes negotiations get heated. I'm in no immediate danger, and I'd appreciate privacy to continue our conversation. Marco understood what Francesca was doing, choosing Camorra credibility over police protection, demonstrating that she could face danger without running to authorities, proving she wasn't the weak, educated daughter everyone assumed. But Marco also understood the risk. If he withdrew his officers and Russo killed Francesca, Marco would have failed to protect a witness and lost the best chance at dismantling Naples' criminal networks. The moment stretched into something unbearable until finally Marco gave orders for his team to withdraw. If anything happens to you, Marco said quietly as he passed Francesca, I'll burn this entire organization to the ground. Then the police were gone, and Francesca stood alone again, surrounded by men who'd been seconds away from killing her. Russo's expression had transformed from rage into something more complex, curiosity mixed with grudging respect. You sent away the police who could have saved you. Why? Francesca's answer was simple and carried the weight of truth. Because I'm not building power through fear or alliances with authorities. I'm building it through respect and demonstrating that I understand this world, even if I want to change it. Letting Marco arrest you would have made me seem weak and dependent. Facing you alone proves I'm neither. Russo circled Francesca slowly, reevaluating. You are either very brave or very foolish. I haven't decided which. Francesca stood tall despite exhaustion and fear singing through her blood. I'm the daughter of Don Esposito. I grew up watching my father negotiate with men who wanted him dead. I learned that the most dangerous moment in any confrontation is when your enemy underestimates you. You've underestimated me from the beginning, Don Russo. That's why you're losing this war, even though you have more soldiers and territory. The accusation struck deep, and Russo's hand moved toward the pistol at his waist. For 3 heartbeats, Francesca thought he would shoot her himself, end this confrontation with violence that proved he was still dominant despite everything she'd accomplished. But Russo lowered his hand and instead made an offer that shocked Francesca more than death threats could. I will accept your compromise. We divide Naples, east and west. We establish rules limiting civilian casualties, and we see who builds the stronger organization over the next year. If you fail, if your idealistic approach proves insufficient, I absorb your territory without resistance. If you succeed, Russo paused, clearly hating what he was about to say. If you succeed, perhaps Naples can sustain two families operating under different philosophies. It wasn't friendship or peace or anything close to justice for her murdered family, but it was survival, breathing room, a chance to prove her vision could work. Francesca accepted with a handshake that sealed agreements older than courts or contracts, and she walked out of Castel dell'Ovo alive with a compromise that would either save Naples or destroy her. But as she crossed back toward the city, Francesca realized the most dangerous battle wasn't with Russo. It was with her own soldiers who'd expect traditional Camorra leadership and might not accept a boss who negotiated instead of killed, who sought transformation instead of dominance, who was trying to redeem a family name built on generations of blood. The real war was just beginning, and Francesca had no idea if she was strong enough to win it. The compromise with Russo lasted exactly 47 days before everything collapsed, and it collapsed because Francesca underestimated how deeply tradition ran through the Camorra's blood. She'd spent those weeks building her organization according to principles Naples had never seen, recruiting members based on intelligence rather than violence, investing in legitimate businesses that actually helped neighborhoods instead of bleeding them, establishing rules that protected civilians and limited the warfare that had defined generations. Her soldiers included university graduates, former business owners, even women, a revolutionary concept that scandalized traditionalists who believed the Camorra was exclusively male territory. Francesca was creating something new, and Naples watched with equal parts fascination and horror. But innovation requires patience that young soldiers raised on violence and quick money don't possess. The crisis came when three of Francesca's newest recruits, barely 20 years old, hungry for respect, decided to prove themselves by robbing one of Russo's gambling operations without authorization. It was stupid, reckless, and violated the compromise that was keeping Naples from open warfare. Russo responded predictably by capturing all three young men and sending a message to Francesca. Either she executed her own soldiers for breaking the peace agreement, or Russo would consider the compromise void and resume war. Francesca had 24 hours to decide between murdering her own people or watching everything she'd built burn. She called an emergency meeting at her headquarters, a warehouse in Naples' Sanità district that she'd converted into offices instead of the traditional smoke-filled backrooms where bosses usually conducted business. The warehouse still smelled of the lemons that used to be stored there, and Francesca found the scent comforting in a way nothing else about this situation was. Her senior captains gathered around a conference table that looked more corporate than criminal. Tommaso Greco, her father's former consigliere who still questioned every unconventional decision. Davide Amato, her first soldier and most loyal defender. Angela Russo, no relation to Don Russo, the sharp financial analyst who'd left legitimate banking to manage Francesca's accounts. And Marco Calabresi, the carabinieri captain whose unofficial alliance with Francesca had grown into something complicated by shared goals and undeniable attraction they both pretended not to notice. "We execute them," Tommaso said flatly, starting the discussion with the traditional solution. "They violated your direct orders, broke the compromise keeping us alive, and their punishment sends a message that you enforce discipline. It's unpleasant, but necessary." Davide disagreed immediately. "We can't execute children for making a mistake. That's exactly the kind of violence we're trying to move away from. If we kill our own people for stepping out of line, how are we any different from Russo or any other boss who rules through fear?" The argument escalated with others joining until Francesca raised her hand for silence. When she spoke, her voice carried the exhaustion of someone who'd been fighting impossible battles for months without rest. "I didn't build this organization to become another version of what my father was. I built it to prove that Naples can have leadership that protects instead of destroys. But I also can't ignore that those three young men put all of you at risk with their actions. If I refuse to punish them, Russo resumes war and people die. If I execute them, I become the thing I promised I'd never be." Francesca looked at each person around the table, seeking an answer none of them could provide. Angela, the banker turned criminal, offered a pragmatic solution. What if we don't kill them, but we don't keep them? Turn them over to authorities on unrelated charges. They go to prison, we maintain discipline, and we don't have blood on our hands. Marco's expression showed conflict between his role as police officer and his personal investment in Francesca's success. I can arrange arrests that look legitimate, but you'd be sacrificing your own people to authorities, which violates different Camorra codes. Your soldiers will question whether you protect them. Francesca understood the trap perfectly. Every choice cost something essential. Execute the young men and become the violent boss she swore she'd never be. Turn them over to police and look weak or treacherous. Do nothing and watch Russo destroy everything. There was no good option, only different versions of failure. The decision was interrupted by chaos. Francesca's phone rang with news that made her blood run cold. Russo wasn't waiting the full 24 hours. His soldiers had just attacked one of Francesca's legitimate businesses, a restaurant in Vomero that employed former criminals trying to rebuild their lives. 3 employees were in the hospital, the restaurant was destroyed, and witnesses said Russo's men specifically targeted civilians to send a message about what happened when you worked for Francesca Esposito. The compromise was already broken, and Francesca's moment of choice had become a moment of crisis. She stood from the conference table, and everyone saw the transformation. The uncertain woman struggling with impossible decisions became the leader who'd survived a basilica massacre and stared down Don Russo without flinching. "We're going to war," Francesca said quietly, and the room went silent. Not the war Russo expects. Not street fighting and revenge killings and the cycle of violence that's destroyed Naples for generations. We're going to wage war using every tool I've spent months building: economic pressure, political allies, media exposure, and yes, strategic violence when necessary. But violence on my terms, following rules that protect the city I'm trying to save. Tommaso objected immediately. You can't fight a traditional boss with unconventional methods. He'll slaughter us while we're trying to hold press conferences. Francesca's response carried steel that surprised even her oldest advisors. Then we'll have to be smarter than him, faster, more creative. We'll attack his finances, his political connections, his reputation. We'll make it impossible for him to operate in Naples without destroying the city he claims to control. The plan Francesca outlined over the next hour was audacious and risky, and required perfect coordination between criminal operations, police cooperation, political maneuvering, and media manipulation. Angela would trigger investigations into Russo's money laundering by anonymously providing evidence to financial regulators. Marco would coordinate carabinieri raids on Russo's most violent operations, while carefully avoiding anything that would expose his cooperation with Francesca. Davide would lead a small team in surgical strikes against Russo's infrastructure, not killing people, but destroying equipment, sabotaging shipments, creating chaos. And Francesca herself would do something no Camorra boss had ever attempted. She'd go public. Within 48 hours, Francesca Esposito gave an interview to Italy's largest newspaper that shocked the nation. She admitted her family's criminal past, but claimed to be transforming the organization into something legitimate. She provided evidence of Russo's recent attacks on civilians, painted him as a dinosaur refusing to evolve, and positioned herself as representing Naples's future against its violent past. Traditional Camorra bosses would have killed her for speaking publicly about family business. But Francesca understood that the old rules were weapons used to keep people like her powerless. Breaking those rules strategically was how you changed the system. The interview made Francesca famous overnight, celebrated by some as a revolutionary, condemned by others as a criminal trying to rebrand violence as progress. But most importantly, it put Russo in an impossible position. If he killed Francesca now, he'd be murdering someone who'd become a public figure, bringing investigative attention he couldn't survive. If he did nothing, he looked weak compared to a woman who was openly defying Camorra traditions. Russo responded the only way he knew how, escalating violence. His soldiers attacked two more of Francesca's businesses, shot Davide in an ambush that nearly killed him, and left a message written in blood on Francesca's mother's doorstep, warning that everyone she loved would die. Francesca visited Davide in the hospital where he was recovering from surgery that removed a bullet from his chest. "This is my fault," she said quietly, standing by his bed. "I put you in danger with my idealistic crusade to change Naples. Maybe my mother was right. Maybe I'm just a businesswoman playing at being a boss." Davide, pale and weak but alive, grabbed Francesca's hand with surprising strength. "You're the first boss I've ever believed in. The first leader who makes me think Naples could be something other than violence and corruption. If I die for that, at least I died for something worth dying for." The words broke something open in Francesca that had been building since the Basilica massacre: doubt, fear, the weight of responsibility for lives she might be destroying with her choices. She left the hospital and made a decision that terrified her, but felt inevitable. Francesca called Russo and proposed something that violated every strategic advantage she'd built: a face-to-face meeting, just the two of them, no soldiers or witnesses, at the Church of Gesù Nuovo in Naples' historic center. The same square where her father used to bring her as a child, where she'd learned to love this impossible city despite everything it represented. Russo agreed, probably sensing an opportunity to end this war by killing Francesca personally. Marco and Tommaso both tried to talk her out of it, arguing she was walking into a trap, but Francesca knew that some battles couldn't be won through strategy or alliances or clever planning. Sometimes you had to face your enemy directly and bet everything on who you were versus who they were. The night before the meeting, Francesca's mother visited her for the first time since their fight. Sofia Esposito looked older than her years, worn down by grief and fear, and watching her only surviving child wage war that might make her childless. "Your father would be proud of you," Sofia said quietly. "Angry and confused about your methods, but proud. You're braver than he ever was because you're brave enough to try changing things instead of just surviving them." The words brought tears Francesca couldn't suppress, and mother and daughter held each other in the home where Francesca had learned what family meant before violence redefined the word. Whatever happened tomorrow, at least she knew her mother understood why she was fighting. Francesca arrived at the Church of Gesù Nuovo just after midnight when Naples was quiet except for the ghosts that haunt every ancient city. The Baroque church's facade, covered in diamond-point stones that looked like armor, seemed appropriate for a meeting that would decide whether Naples' future belonged to violence or transformation. She wore black again, though this time not for mourning but for practicality, and she carried the pistol her father had given her on her 18th birthday, a weapon she'd never fired but had learned to maintain with the same discipline she applied to everything. Francesca entered the church alone as agreed, walking past frescoes depicting saints and martyrs who'd died for beliefs they wouldn't compromise. She wondered if she'd join them by sunrise. Don Russo was already there, kneeling in a front pew as if praying, though Francesca doubted the man had spoken to God honestly in decades. He stood when he heard her footsteps echoing through the empty church, and in the candlelight he looked older and more tired than she remembered. "You came," Russo said with something that might have been approval. "I half expected you to bring police or soldiers despite our agreement." Francesca stopped in the center aisle, maintaining distance. "I keep my word even when negotiating with men who don't. That's the difference between us, Don Russo. I'm trying to build something based on trust and transformation. You're clinging to a world built on fear and violence that's dying, whether you accept it or not." Russo walked toward her slowly, and Francesca's hand moved subtly toward the pistol concealed at her waist. "You speak of my world dying, but I see a young woman who's been playing at power for 4 months losing a war she never understood. Your soldiers are defecting back to traditional families. Your businesses are struggling because legitimate operations don't generate criminal profits. Your mother is terrified every day that I'll kill her daughter. And your idealistic crusade has accomplished nothing except proving that Naples isn't ready for whatever fantasy you're selling." Each accusation landed with the weight of truth because Russo was right about most of it. Francesca's revolution was failing by conventional measures. She'd lost more than she'd gained, endangered everyone she cared about, and discovered that transforming centuries of tradition required more than good intentions and business school education. But Francesca smiled, and it was the same cold smile she'd learned from her father. "You're right that I've lost by traditional standards, but you've missed what I've actually accomplished. In 4 months, I've inspired 50 former criminals to choose legitimate work over violence. I've convinced a dozen politicians that Naples can change. I've created alliances between police and community members that didn't exist before. And most importantly, I've shown everyone, especially women growing up in neighborhoods where Camorra rule seems inevitable, that leadership doesn't require brutality. That's not failure, Don Russo. That's planting seeds for a future you won't live to see because you represent everything Naples needs to leave behind." Russo's expression hardened and his hand moved toward his own weapon, poetic words from a dead woman. But before Russo could draw, the church's side doors burst open and chaos erupted from multiple directions. Marco Calabresi and his carabinieri team flooded in from the north entrance, weapons drawn and shouting commands. Davide Amato, discharged from hospital against medical advice, led Francesca's soldiers through the south entrance, surrounding Russo's position. And from the main entrance came something unexpected. Antonio Russo, Don Russo's own nephew and heir apparent, walking slowly toward his uncle with a weapon pointed at the man who'd raised him. "Uncle Salvatore," Antonio said, his voice carrying regret and determination. "I can't let you kill her. Francesca Esposito represents change that Naples desperately needs. You represent the violence that's destroyed our city for generations. I've spent the past month watching you escalate a war that's killing innocents and accomplishing nothing except proving how irrelevant our old ways have become. So, I'm making a choice. I'm defecting to Francesca's family because she's trying to build something worth believing in." The betrayal shattered Russo's composure completely. "You would betray your blood for this woman who's been destroying everything we built?" Antonio nodded slowly. "She's not destroying, she's transforming. And I'd rather be part of that transformation than another generation perpetuating cycles of violence that killed my father, my cousins, and will eventually kill me if nothing changes." Other soldiers who'd arrived with Russo began lowering their weapons, clearly torn between loyalty to their Don and recognition that Antonio was right about Naples needing something different. Francesca watched the scene unfold with emotions she couldn't process, relief that she wasn't dying tonight, shock that Russo's own nephew had switched sides, and overwhelming gratitude toward people who believed in her vision enough to risk everything. But Russo wasn't finished. With the desperation of a man watching his empire crumble, he lunged toward Francesca with his weapon raised and murder in his eyes. Multiple things happened simultaneously. Marco shouted and moved to intercept, Davide fired a shot that missed in the chaos, and Francesca's own hand finally drew the pistol her father had given her years ago. She didn't think, didn't hesitate, didn't freeze like she'd feared she might when facing actual violence. Francesca fired once, and the bullet hit Russo's shoulder, spinning him sideways and making him drop his weapon. He collapsed against a pew, bleeding and defeated but alive, and Francesca stood over him with the gun still raised. "I could kill you," Francesca said quietly, her voice steady despite adrenaline flooding her system. "I have every reason and right. You murdered my father, my brothers, attacked my people, tried to destroy everything I'm building. Traditional Camorra justice says you die here, tonight, as revenge and warning." Russo stared up at her with something between hatred and resignation. "Then do it. Be the boss you keep pretending you're not. Prove you're no different than your father or me or every other person who's ruled Naples through blood." The words were meant to provoke, but Francesca surprised everyone, including herself, by lowering the weapon. "I'm not going to kill you, Don Russo. I'm going to do something worse from your perspective. I'm going to let you live and watch Naples move forward without you." Marco moved in to arrest Russo on charges that would put him away for life, based on evidence Francesca had been gathering for months. As Carabinieri officers handcuffed the former Don who'd terrorized Naples for decades, Francesca felt exhaustion replacing adrenaline. She'd won, but victory felt less triumphant and more like survival, painful, costly, leaving scars that would never fully heal. Antonio approached her as his uncle was being led away. "What happens now?" he asked. Francesca considered the question carefully. "Now we rebuild. Not my family, and not yours. Something new that includes pieces of both. We create leadership that Naples needs instead of leadership that feeds on Naples. It won't be easy, and many people won't accept it, but at least we'll be trying." The months following Russo's arrest brought changes that transformed Naples slowly and imperfectly. Francesca merged her organization with the defecting members of Russo's family, creating a hybrid structure that combined traditional Camorra networks with legitimate business operations and community investment. She established rules that limited violence, protected civilians, and gradually shifted focus from criminal enterprise toward political influence and economic development. Not everyone supported the transformation. Traditionalists called her a traitor, reformers called her too compromised by criminal connections, and authorities remained skeptical that anyone born into the Camorra could truly change. But Francesca persisted with the same determination that had carried her through Basilica massacres and death threats and impossible choices. She opened youth programs in Naples' poorest neighborhoods, employed former criminals in legitimate businesses, and used her platform to advocate for policies that addressed the poverty-feeding organized crime. She wasn't naive enough to think Naples would become crime-free overnight, but she believed creating alternatives to violence was better than accepting violence as inevitable. Her relationship with Marco evolved from professional alliance into something personal. Two people from opposite sides of the law, discovering they shared the same goal of saving a city they both loved, despite its flaws. 1 year after the Basilica massacre, Francesca visited her family's graves in Naples' monumental cemetery. She brought flowers for her father, her brothers, and the version of herself who died that day and been reborn into something she never imagined becoming. "I didn't become you, Papa," Francesca said quietly to the headstone bearing her father's name. "I became something different. I hope wherever you are, you understand why." The response came not from ghosts, but from her mother, who'd arrived quietly and stood beside her daughter among the dead. "He understands," Sophia said, "and he's proud, as am I." They stood together as sunset painted Naples in shades of gold and amber, the city spreading below them in all its impossible beauty and tragedy and potential. Francesca thought about the girl who'd run away to Milan 6 years ago, trying to escape her family's legacy, about the woman who'd returned seeking revenge, and about the leader she'd become by choosing transformation over tradition. She wasn't Don Esposito's daughter anymore. She wasn't even entirely Francesca Esposito. She was something new, a woman who'd taken power not by inheritance or violence, but by refusing to accept that the future had to look like the past. Naples would never be perfect. The Camorra would never completely disappear. Violence and corruption would persist despite her best efforts. But Francesca had proven something that mattered more than perfect victory. She'd proven that change was possible, that women could lead in worlds built to exclude them, and that the most revolutionary act wasn't destroying enemies, but transforming the systems that created them. As she left the cemetery with her mother, Francesca received a call from Antonio about new investments their organization was making in affordable housing. She smiled, answering the call and returning to the work of rebuilding Naples one difficult choice at a time. The Esposito family's empire had died with her father and brothers. But something better was rising from those ashes. An organization that protected instead of preyed, that invested instead of exploited, that offered Naples a future where children didn't grow up knowing violence as the only path to power. It wasn't the legacy her father built, or the revenge her brothers would have sought. It was something uniquely Francesca's, justice that looked like transformation, power that looked like service, and leadership that proved the daughter everyone underestimated was exactly who Naples needed to imagine a different future.